Good morning, everyone. This is Sunny Lou Williams, your host for this morning. Thank you all for joining us for the Disability and Impairments as defined by Social Security Administration. We have Carrie Sheward and Megan Lallman from Tangram to present with us today. But before we get started with the content, a couple of items on housekeeping. A reminder that this webinar series is brought to you by the Division of Mental Health and Addiction through the Cultural Linguistic Competency and Health Disparities Project. The project vision, persons of all cultures and ethnicities partnering with local and state systems to achieve equity in access, services, interventions, and outcomes in our systems, with a mission of facilitating cultural and linguistic competency strategies throughout Indiana's state and local systems to improve outcomes for populations vulnerable to disparities and disproportionalities. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we were not able to secure a direct representative from the Chicago office of Social Security Administration. But the office did provide very good recommendations on specifically the takeaways and objectives for today, which were to identify disability definition through Social Security and the steps to identify that definition. So thankfully, there was a very detailed overview on the Social Security website. And as the underlying theme of these webinars, the approach to policy, the identification of good resources and tools for our mental health and addiction providers to use, I felt it pertinent to directly go to the information that's available on the Social Security site. So let's begin with an overview of Social Security as defined by this, disability as defined by the Social Security Administration. Why is this a topic, and why are we discussing this within the context of cultural competency in relation to mental health and addiction providers? Well, simplistically, as providers, we serve many individuals that could qualify for additional Social Security benefits. And having at least a working knowledge or a resource direction or referral direction for that knowledge is important to account for social determinants of health and overall access and resource support for our clients. So here on the Social Security Administration site, as you'll see, and all of the links are a part of will be sent as a follow-up and also provided within the question and answer resources here on the webinar today. You'll find an actual planner walkthrough of how to discuss Social Security disability and also the definition and tools in identifying what constitutes disability. Now, as a disclosure, this is not a how-to, but rather a definition guidance and the appropriate resources provided. So the definition of disability provided by the Social Security Administration is actually a checklist. If you go through this question checklist, the step-by-step questions involved are, in the context of you working with your clients, a question first of, are you working? So in 2020, earnings averaging more than $1,260 a month is not considered disabled. There are additional determinations to look at condition severity. So number 2, if your condition or your client's condition has significantly limited your ability to do basic work such as lifting, standing, walking, sitting, and remembering for at least 12 months. So as we look at this and review this information, there is a significant social determinants of health factor here to account for the employability and the ongoing ability to do work by the individual impacted. And then, is your condition found in the list of disabling conditions? And here, there are a list of medical conditions of which we will navigate towards. Conditions resulting in Part A and Part B. So if you click on the list of medical conditions, Part A goes through the listing of conditions, which is the listing of impairments, and Part A goes through specifically those for individuals 18 and over. Part B goes through the conditions for children under the age or persons under the age of 18, primarily children. And these specific conditions will specifically list out adult listings as identified here, including specifically mental disorders, which we will click on here as well. And you'll see as we go through a scrolling of a short section, neurocognitive disorders, schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders, depressive bipolar related disorders, intellectual disorders, and so on. Again, the intent of this is to navigate the tool and showcase additional resources that could be provided to clients, but is not an advocacy, of course, of the specific organizations and actually supporting application for benefits for disability for Social Security Administration. Here are the childhood listings. And again, in this context, utilizing this as an education resource for referral to clients. And again, not specific to supporting direct benefits, eligibility, or submission. Then as we go through and take a look at the prior documentation, there are two initiatives that are designated to expedite processing of new disability claims. One, compassionate allowances, and two, quick disability determinations. As we click on compassionate allowances, these are specific items that have been provided through the National Institutes of Health and medical and scientific experts to identify compassionate allowance conditions, which are specific disease states as being diagnosed that pertain to immediate and or faster receipt of disability benefits through Social Security Administration. Here then is the list of compassionate allowance conditions. And as you click through those are the specific items and disease states listed here that account for a compassionate allowance faster determination. There's a significant number of disease states here, so I won't scroll through all of those items. As you take a look at quick disability determinations, that is also the internal way of how Social Security Administration is going through and processing cases to account for a higher probability of allowance. Then on the fourth side for checklist of items, can you do the work you did previously? Deciding if medical impairments prevent you from performing any of the past work, and if it doesn't, then that is not a definition of qualifying disability. And then a consideration of can you or can the client conduct any work that was done in the past? And we consider medical conditions upon age, education, past work experience, any transferable skills that may be had. Then certainly with these definitions of understanding the disability, we look at this tool on the Social Security Administration's direct site, planners./disability, to be a good checklist of overall understanding of a referral source and whether or not to recommend this to your clients as an opportunity for alleviating social determinants of health. Okay, now as we transition, the importance of understanding definition of disability is really based upon one of the key applications of understanding policy and policy impact to disability and impairments. Throughout the webinar series, we've discussed primary policies impacting our key topics for each webinar. And disability and impairments, as you can see from the very hierarchical website and detailed definitions, is a rolling assessment of additional chronic diseases and additional medical conditions that account for the definition of disability. Please utilize the Social Security Administration site at ssa.gov/planner/benefits as really a rolling resource tool of the types of chronic conditions, disease states, medical conditions, and other contributing factors that are allowing for additional disability and impairment definitions as the Social Security Administration reviews medical information and disease impacts throughout. Again, the resource link will be provided within the chat tool and also within the follow-up resource for this webinar. Now I'd like to introduce the Tangram team, Carrie Sheward and Megan Lauman, as our speakers today to discuss overall disability and impairments and giving great content and context around the support for individuals with disabilities and also the additional definitions and context around the integrated support in this environment. So first off, an introduction of Carrie Sheward. Carrie began her career in the area of community employment services in 1991. She worked for a community mental health center in various capacities, with the majority of her time spent in crisis services for individuals with severe and persistent mental health diagnoses. Carrie changed her course in 2013 when her son was diagnosed with autism. She returned to college and earned a graduate degree in psychology with a specialization in applied behavior analysis. She became board certified by the Behavior Analyst Certification Board and worked as a program manager and then clinical director for large autism provider. While developing community connections and educating public entities, Carrie learned of the services Tangram was providing. She joined the Tangram team as Vice President of Clinical Services in 2019 and oversees the current behavior programs while also identifying ways to expand programming. Carrie and her husband live in Noblesville and share 8 children, 3 daughters-in-law, and 1 granddaughter with 1 more on the way. Thank you very much, Carrie, for being with us today. I'd also like to introduce Megan Lauman. Megan is a licensed social worker, life coach, and behavior consultant with Tangram Life Coaching. She has extensive experience in serving at-risk children and young adults and uses her expertise to help individuals with disabilities gain the tools they need to achieve their personal goals. Tangram Life Coaching was created to serve individuals with hidden or mild disabilities and other barriers who otherwise may not qualify for other support systems. Tangram Life Coaching partners with mental health providers and to address the needs of clients with mental health issues as part of a holistic approach to serving those with disabilities and other barriers to access. Ladies, thank you so much for participating today and being our speakers on this very important topic of developmental disabilities and behavioral interventions.
So today we're going to address the behavioral consultation world that we are working in under the Medicaid waiver. So we're working with individuals with developmental disabilities, primarily focusing on behavioral interventions that can ameliorate symptoms, allowing individuals to engage more functionally in their community.
So just to talk very briefly about what defines a developmental disability. For it to be a developmental disability, it has to occur before the age of 22. It will result in an effect on functioning level that significantly impacts the individual compared to their peers, and the impact is going to last throughout the individual's lifetime. So for a developmental disability, it's not something that they're going to recover from. There's going to be an effect throughout their life.
We also deal with individuals with intellectual disabilities. So these can be caused by genetic disorders such as Down syndrome, Rett syndrome, perhaps an injury or an infection, cerebral palsy, a traumatic brain injury, fetal alcohol syndrome. So these are kind of co-occurring issues that we might see with some of the individuals that we are working with. This diagnosis occurs before the age of 18, and functioning varies because it's determined when there are limits related to learning and at expected level and functioning in those daily living skills. It used to be based solely off of an IQ score, but those clarifiers have now been removed.
I should have kicked this one your way. So for autism, the phrase that I like to use with autism is when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Autism is a very wide spectrum, and the spectrum has grown astronomically in the last few years to capture a lot more individuals. With autism, there used to be several different diagnoses, pervasive developmental disorder, autism, and Asperger's syndrome. Those are all now lumped under in the United States, if they're using the DSM, as autism spectrum disorder, and then it's kind of ranked on a functional level. And when you're thinking of autism, you have to remember that the functionality, so if they're diagnosed with high functioning autism, that's from the clinician's perspective that diagnosed them, not necessarily from their perspective. So you could have an individual that's nonverbal, but is very functional and is very happy and satisfied in their life, but they may be diagnosed with low functioning autism because they're nonverbal or non-communicative, whereas you may have somebody who communicates very well, but really struggles with anxiety and what we would consider functioning, but they may be considered high functioning because they're verbal and able to communicate. The thing that's pretty consistent across the board with autism is social difficulties. Difficulty regulating emotions, and individuals with autism may appear to be immature. That's when you have like a 15-year-old, 16-year-old that's still throwing a temper tantrum, may have verbal outbursts, things like that. Communication difficulties. Individuals with autism generally pick up well on body language and vocal tone. What they don't necessarily pick up on well is what you communicate with your eyes. There's a lot of really cool research out there about why that happens. And if you want more information, you can email me and I can bombard you with the information. But when you're communicating with somebody with autism, they generally do not understand sarcasm very well, and they often take statements literally. I work with a young man who's 13. He was in a car with a friend and the friend's family, and they asked him if he wanted to listen to country music. He didn't know what country music was. He lives in the city, so he said, "No, I prefer city music, thank you." Very literal statement. So things like cut it out, knock it off, grow up, those could be difficult for somebody with autism to understand. You may see repetitive behaviors such as flapping arms or walking on toes. This is typically sensory in nature. It's a self-calming thing. We all have calming behaviors that we do. For individuals with autism, it may be a little more outward. And so you're going to see it more. And a lot of these things have to do with pressure points. Walking on toes, there's a pressure point in the ball of your foot that's very calming. And so you may see a lot of toe walking, things like that. There are some physical and medical issues that may accompany autism that then just exacerbate symptoms. We do see individuals who have epilepsy. There are genetic disorders that can lead to a diagnosis with autism. The biggest one is Fragile X syndrome right now, but there are several others that will result in a diagnosis of autism. Gastrointestinal disorders. People with autism, there's a whole line of research about gut biomes and bacteria in the gut. If you want to go down another rabbit trail, you can go down that one. But a lot of our moods and stabilization has to do with our gut health. And when your gut doesn't work right, everything else is kind of wonky. And so we do see a lot of gastrointestinal issues, constipation, poor diets, picky diets with autism.
It kind of ties into that whole rule out medical issues first. So if we're working with an individual that might be nonverbal and can't communicate the fact that their stomach doesn't feel well, then we can kind of look at some of those behaviors and go down that path first before we start addressing the specific behavior to rule out that gastrointestinal issue.
You may also see a lot of sleep dysfunction with individuals with autism, which actually ties into the GI issues. But I work with an individual that will stay up for 36, 48 hours and then will sleep for 16 to 20 hours. And so there's a lot of flipping of night and day, very short sleep cycles, which then can cause issues with other things. pica, eating non-edible items, rocks, dirt, string.
Mhm.
We get a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And then we often see some type of sensory processing component, sensory processing disorder with individuals with autism. Individuals may be sensitive to certain things, such as too much noise, touch, but they also may be sensory seeking, where they seek out different things. So you may have an individual that you're working with that doesn't like light touch, but seeks out kind of deep, heavy pressure touches. Anything you want to add on autism?
No, I think what is really kind of cool about society right now is this has become more mainstream. I know from personal experience, locating equipment such as headphones or weighted blankets or weighted vests, any kind of sensory materials, you used to have to really search for those things, and now you can go to a local store and those are commonly found there. So it's nice for families to be able to not have to really research and spend huge amounts of money to access some of these adaptations that we have.
So the next one is cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy, a person with CP typically finds voluntary movements and purposeful movements difficult. And you may also see muscle spasms with cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy occurs, is diagnosed due to an injury before, during, or shortly after birth. Cerebral palsy can be diagnosed up to the age of 3. So if something happens between birth and 3, that can still be diagnosed as cerebral palsy. The thing with cerebral palsy to remember is it's damage to the brain. So the part of the brain that's affected is the part of the body that's going to be affected. So you can have somebody with cerebral palsy that only their legs are affected, or half of their body is affected. We work with a young lady who is quadriplegic cerebral palsy, and it also affects her vocal cords. So she's nonverbal. She uses a communication device to communicate. And the big thing with her is she talks about her cerebral palsy. She feels like she's in jail. She has a brain that works correctly. She's of average intelligence. Without her cerebral palsy, she would be a fully functioning adult. But because she has cerebral palsy, she requires total care. She has to have somebody take her to the bathroom. She has to have somebody cook her meal. She has to have somebody help her eat. And she will say, sometimes I feel like I'm in jail, because she has friends who are able to do all the things that she wants to be able to do, but her body won't allow her to do.
I think it's important when we're serving these individuals to recognize all individuals have strengths, and to be very aware of their abilities, and just not lump someone as, okay, they can't move their arms, they can't move their legs, so I'm going to speak for them as well and make all these decisions, when in fact they're quite capable of doing all of those things on their own.
I worked with a lady for many years who had cerebral palsy, who owned her own home. She had quadriplegic cerebral palsy, so she was in a power chair up until probably the last 2 or 3 years of her life. She spent most of her time alone doing what she wanted to do. She had very minimal staffing, and when we would bring a staff in to meet her, the very first thing that she would say is, "I'm not retarded, don't treat me like I am." And many people just assumed, because she was in a wheelchair and she had difficulty speaking, that she had intellectual disability, and she was very quick to tell you that she did not.
And it can be minor. I know that earlier on in the slide, it talks about minor motor skill deficits, and I am working with a young woman right now, and honestly, I did not realize that she had a cerebral palsy diagnosis until I was looking at some of her historical information, because she is so minimally affected, and it's just a minor nuance of her gait that makes it even noticeable. So it's interesting the way it can present.
Down syndrome. This is probably, honestly, the most familiar, I would say, of developmental disabilities. being diagnosed, and that's kind of what introduced the world to developmental disabilities as far as like the media was concerned, things like that. People with Down syndrome are born with an extra chromosome. People with Down syndrome typically can understand language better than they can communicate it. So when you're working with somebody with Down syndrome, you may ask them to do something and they understand what you're saying, but they may not be able to express it back. So they may appear not to understand. So great ways are, can you show me the steps, or can you repeat back to me, so that you can grasp, to make sure that they understand what you're asking. Other difficulties: visual impairments, delay in fine and gross motor skills, language impairments. People with Down syndrome are also more likely to have cardiac issues, and people with Down syndrome are more likely to develop early onset Alzheimer's. This is due to the fact that the gene that produces the protein that becomes the plaque that results in Alzheimer's is produced on the gene that is triplicated in Down syndrome. And so right around late 30s, early 40s are individuals that have Down syndrome. We actually start doing dementia screens on them so that we can catch it quickly and hopefully slow the progression if they are starting to show signs of dementia.
And due to the cardiac issues, individuals with Down syndrome historically didn't live a long period of time and would die sometime in their 30s and 40s. And we're seeing with just healthy progressions in medical treatments and things that these individuals are living longer. So that makes it all the more important to kind of look at that early onset Alzheimer's so we can be proactive there.
Trauma. You really want to know your client's history. Have they been institutionalized? If they have a developmental disability and they're probably in their late 30s or older, they have spent time in institutions, because that's what we did. Prior to the early 90s, people that had developmental disabilities were either kept at home within their family's home, or they were institutionalized. We didn't have the community settings that we have now for individuals who have developmental disabilities. In those institutions, there was a lot of abuse and neglect due to a lot of reasons, but chances are, if they've been institutionalized, they have been mechanically restrained, they've been physically restrained, they've probably been over-medicated, and so there's a trauma base to that. It's
generally, yeah, good to just go with that assumption and rule that out, that at some point, and it might be, everyone's trauma is different, like the medication and that sort of thing. So it might not have even been like an intentional physical abuse or neglect, but individuals that have to rely on other people for their daily care tend to, unfortunately, end up victims of trauma. Some are incarcerated. Unfortunately, a lot of our jails and prison systems are full of individuals with a developmental disability that may or may not understand the impact of what their behaviors were to lead to this position.
I work with a gentleman that was incarcerated, and then it was determined after about 6 months of incarceration that he didn't understand what he had done. And so they put him in an institution. And in both of those settings, he was repeatedly assaulted. And there was an incident once he was moved out into the community with a police officer, and the client was very heated. The officer tried to force him to do something, put his hand on the client's shoulder. The client swung backwards and scratched the officer. He wasn't being aggressive towards the officer. That was a trigger for his trauma. He was already heated. He was already kind of in that fight or flight. And the officer putting his hand on his shoulder and trying to force him into his apartment immediately took him back to his trauma that he had experienced through being incarcerated and being institutionalized. Also know if they've spent time in the foster care system and or are adopted. We know even from individuals who are adopted at birth can show signs of trauma. So that's something to be aware of. Know what their triggers are, what reminds them of their trauma. And there is a really big overlap in symptoms. And so this just kind of shows an overlap between ADHD and trauma symptoms. There's an overlap between autism and trauma symptoms. There's an overlap between ADHD and autism. So kind of the rule of thumb, I always like to look for the trauma first, because if you're not dealing with the trauma, then nothing else is going to help. As much as you treat the ADHD symptoms, until you're addressing the trauma, you won't see success.
And chances are, if you are seeing some of these overlapping symptoms, the distractibility, difficulty listening, disorganization, restlessness, if you delve into an individual's history, you might be able to quickly uncover some trauma that you can deal with, and then move on to address the specific diagnosis associated with that.
So individuals that have developmental disabilities are often what we call dually diagnosed. So they have the developmental disability and they have a mental health diagnosis. So the ones that we commonly see are depression and anxiety, ODD, we see that one frequently, especially with kids, ADHD. Prior to probably, 5-6 years ago, we started seeing like people in their mid to late 20s come in who had diagnoses of ADHD, who actually have autism. But at that time, a lot of the parents were given the option when they were diagnosed as young children to pick a diagnosis. And so a lot of times the option that they chose was ADHD. And they do have ADHD, but they also have autism. And so you may see individuals that are coming in who have diagnoses such as these, but also have developmental disability, such as autism that was missed.
And it's super important to kind of weed out those specific things. So you might have an individual with autism who also suffers from anxiety, and how do you address the anxiety separate from the autistic features? So it's important to look at those separately.
Sensory processing disorder, we talked about that under autism. Bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder. This one is, and this is another rabbit trail that you can go down because there's a bunch of research about it. But there is a group of individuals, usually females in their late teens or early 20s, who autism looks very different for females than it does for males. And what they are seeing within the field is females that are coming and getting a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder that actually have high functioning autism, or what we would have several years ago called Asperger's syndrome. So that's something to be aware of. There's a lot of overlap between the symptoms, but you address them very differently. If you're going from borderline personality disorder treatment plan versus an autism treatment plan. And so you really want to delve into kind of developmental history and things like that to see if possibly it is an autism diagnosis.
And it's important because you really have a difficult time if you're going to implement a protocol for a borderline personality disorder diagnosis with an individual that actually has autism. It doesn't follow suit. So it's very important to distinguish which one you're addressing at the time.
And then language processing or other non-specific learning disabilities. Once again, this goes into the individuals right now that are probably in their mid to late 20s, early 30s, who when they were going through school, were struggling with something, and instead of giving an autism diagnosis, they received like a language processing or that's what it is non-specific learning disability diagnosis to get them services when they actually have high functioning autism.
And we found individuals that we've talked to recently that were diagnosed with language processing disorder, and they realize, wow, you know, I might actually have autism, and it is actually opening up a whole new world. They're like, wow, I had all these other symptoms, and I never quite fit this mold of just the language processing.
I worked with an individual through our life coaching program several years ago that was diagnosed with ADHD and had a laundry list of mental health issues. And I had just asked him if high functioning autism had ever come on board, and he started doing, and it hadn't, and he had started doing some research on his own, and a huge light bulb went off for him, and it brought a lot of things together for him that he was like, now I feel like I belong somewhere. Now I feel like I understand myself. None of these other things explained why I was the way that I was. Now I know why. And it was a huge eye-opening moment for him and for his family that he could move beyond and be successful and do the things that he wanted to do with the right supports. He just didn't have the right supports in place because he didn't have the right diagnosis. So one of the things that we wanted to touch base on was the racial disparity as far as diagnostics. Minority children are less likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than their non-Latino white peers. They're also less likely to be treated with medication for ADHD symptoms. They're significantly less likely to be diagnosed with autism than their non-Latino white peers. And diagnosis usually occurs later, thus reducing the chance of early interventions. And a lot of this is because in minority populations, the symptoms are seen as behavioral, not due to autism, not due to ADHD. They're looked at as, you know, poor discipline or lack of structure, things like that, when it actually is coming down to ADHD or autism or another diagnosis. And so these kids are getting interventions much later in life. And the quality of the interventions, the access to high quality mental health services and early intervention services are less.
That's why it's so important to really educate pediatricians, maybe even case managers for the Medicaid system that come in contact with these young individuals early on, that, hey, if you're recognizing some of these symptoms, refer them on for additional assessments and things to access things so they can hopefully progress maybe into a traditional kind of brick and mortar classroom with their peers and maybe have just some minimal supports.
And poverty, food insecurity, the higher levels of violence, they're all contributing to this disparity. And once again, you know, when you're dealing with ADHD symptoms, sometimes it's viewed, well, they just have food insecurity, which that may be contributing to it, but the underlying issue is ADHD or autism or something else.
And poverty plays a huge role. If you are unaware of other supports that can, you know, help you access services that can support you through, you know, financially through those treatment options, then you're not gonna reach out and try and access those. Challenging behaviors.
So we're just going to briefly go through a list of some of the challenging behaviors that we see on a regular basis. So agitation, this may be pacing, crying, yelling, screaming. Attention-seeking behaviors, that's that person that's getting in your face, calling your name, maybe slamming doors, taking things away from people, tapping you on the arm, pulling on clothing. Elopement or leaving supervision. These are your kids that are running away. These are the adults that are supposed to have supervision or leaving their areas. Inappropriate boundaries. This could be calling people obsessively, texting obsessively, or laughing because we have many of those. Yeah. Personal boundaries. This is your personal space. You know, you may have people that are that don't quite get that concept of personal space. And then sexually inappropriate boundaries. This could be making sexually inappropriate comments to people. This could be masturbating in public or in public areas. And
kind of the delineation between the mental health providers and the behavior consultants, to make it a little clearer, we really focus on those observable, measurable behaviors. Everything's a behavior, so that kind of is counterintuitive, but we're looking at that operational definition of agitation. What does that look like? Is it one open, fisted tap to someone? Is it a closed fist punch that happens 3 times consecutively? Very specific criteria for these behaviors that we can address and hopefully decrease or increase, should it be something we want to see happen frequently.
So lies, fabrication, we try to avoid using the term lies for our clients because to lie, there's a level of manipulation that has to occur. And most of the time, our clients don't have the ability to manipulate like that. When they're lying, it's to do things like avoid getting in trouble, or even with sometimes our clients will, it appears that they're lying, but they don't understand what they're being asked. And so we try to avoid the term lies as much as possible. We try to use the term fabrication just because of the connotation that lies has. Perseveration, this is when somebody gets stuck on a topic. It may be repetitively talking about that topic or coming back to that topic cyclically.
And that's something that we see a lot with the individuals that we serve that are diagnosed with autism, that preferred topic and difficulty kind of deviating and exploring other people's perspectives and interests.
Physical aggression, once again, like what Carrie touched on a minute ago, we really operationally define this because if you have a client that's physically aggressive, you need to know what that looks like. Are they going to hit you once and run away? Are they going to smack with an open palm or punch you? I have been doing behavior consulting for almost 9 years here at Tangram, and I've been hit twice. And the first time was because I wasn't following my own behavior plan. I knew what the client looked like when they were physically aggressive. They were showing those signs, and I just didn't get moving fast enough to get out of the way. But this individual would hit once and then it was over. So I knew once I got smacked, he was not going to keep coming at me. If he would have kept coming at me, I would have prepared very differently.
And that's paramount as we're writing behavior plans and training staff, and you have new staff in and out as the world of the direct care professional is ever changing. I think that it's essential for them to understand those antecedents and those precursor behaviors, so and then know what to do when that behavior occurs and how to respond.
Property destruction, this is, could be as basic as, ripping up papers to punching holes in the walls to, ramming a car or a vehicle into, there's a lot of different things. But once again, it comes down to that operational definition. Refusals for our clients, I would say the majority of our clients are adults, so they have the right to refuse things, but that's still a behavior that we may need to work on. If they're refusing to take their medication, they're refusing to take showers, things like that. For the majority of our clients, actually, I don't even think we have any clients that are court ordered to take medication or anything like that. So it's something that we encourage. It's something that we put behavioral strategies in place, but they do have the right to refuse. They're adults.
And it's especially important with safety factors and things like that. That's usually when we push the bar.
Self-injury, this is, you're hitting, biting, scratching themselves, your cutters. Stealing. Verbal aggression, once again, that goes down to the operational definition. Are they going to cuss at you? Are they going to call you names? What names are they going to choose? We have clients that choose racially charged names, not because they understand what they're saying, but because it gets a reaction. So one of the things that we have to work with our staff on is not reacting to the word. If you can take the power out of the word with our clients, they will stop using it. But with racial terms, that can be very difficult. So we have to work a lot on that with some individuals.
It's all about the consequence and reinforcing it. So
I really like this quote. Beneath every behavior, there's a feeling, and beneath each feeling, there is a need. And when we meet that need, rather than focus on the behavior, we begin to deal with the cause, not the symptom. And when we are doing behavior consulting, we really look to what is the client trying to tell us with their behavior? What are they communicating? We all have behaviors. We all communicate through our behaviors. My son says something funny and I laugh. That's a behavior. My daughter refuses to do something and I yell at her. That's a behavior. We're all communicating all the time through our behaviors. The thing that we have to do as consultants is figure out what the behaviors are telling us. What are they communicating? What is it telling us? And what purpose does it serve? Because all behavior has a purpose. My son says something funny because he wants to get that reaction of a laugh from us. So, oh, go ahead.
We address usually kind of the top 4 functions of behavior, starting with attention. So you have 5 in there. So attention could be positive or negative. So please pay attention to me. Stop paying attention to me. I love that cat. So oftentimes you'll see that child acting out in class, and they're getting yelled at by the teacher, but they're still getting attention, and that's better than nothing for them. Or they just want to get a reaction from you, which can be positive or negative.
So we have Mr. Cat that doesn't want, cats are great examples of pay attention to me. You know, knocking things off the counter, this cat sitting on the keyboard, so this individual can't type. Escape, I don't want to do this. I don't understand what you're asking me to do. We see this a lot when, especially for our higher functioning individuals, when they think that they should understand what is being asked, but they're afraid to admit that they don't understand. These are your refusal behaviors, typically. Refusing to take showers, refusing to brush teeth, refusing to go out in the community. So a lot of these are around, I don't understand, or this is embarrassing, or this makes me feel uncomfortable.
And that's a really good example when you're talking about understand the cause of the behavior, because on the surface it might just be, oh, they just don't want to do that. Why don't they want to do that? Accessing tangible, so I want that, give that to me. This is common. You see this in the grocery store with the child that's wanting the candy bar in the aisle, and you often see that reinforced by the parent who finally after 10 minutes is like, whatever, just take the candy. So that child is certainly going to behave that way again in the future because they were able to access what they wanted. This can also be physical. So something is hurting you, something's uncomfortable, I don't feel good. So this is when you want to rule out those medical possibilities.
And for behaviors that come out of the blue or become more intense than they are usually, I always have staff start with physical. Because one, that's usually the easiest to rule out. Mm-hmm. But impending seizure activity or recently having a seizure, we may see an increase in behaviors. If I have an individual that if he doesn't have, I work with an individual that if he doesn't have small seizures regularly, he will build up to a large seizure. And as he's building up to that large seizure, he will have an immense amount of behaviors. If they're diabetic, is blood sugar high or low? Are they, do they get irritable when their blood sugar is high, when their blood sugar is low? What behaviors do you see when those things happen? Especially for our elderly population, urinary tract infections. I can usually tell with my individuals 2 to 3 days before they start showing physical signs of a UTI that they have a UTI just based off of their behaviors. They tend to be more irritable, cranky, maybe more anxious. We may see more refusals, and that's it. a lot of times it will irritate medical doctors because we can call and say, hey, they have a UTI. No, they don't. And then 3 or 4 days later, they have the physical symptoms. We work with an individual who has very limited verbal skills. When he first moved in to one of our homes, he started saying dentist, 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 dentist. Staff took him to the dentist. His teeth were fine. It continued, dentist, 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 dentist. They finally figured out that he had an ear infection. He has chronic ear infections. When he gets an ear infection, his teeth hurt. When your teeth hurt, you go to the dentist. Because of his limited verbal skills, he wasn't able to tell us that his ear was hurting. He was just saying dentist. Now they know when he starts that he probably has an ear infection. We have another client, this one took a while to figure out, would go through periods where she would have a lot of suicidal ideation. We would treat it from a mental health perspective, adjusting mental health medications. Turns out she actually has anemia. And when her iron gets low, she gets suicidal. So now we know when she starts having suicidal ideation that her iron is probably low. We address the iron issue, the suicidal ideation goes away. So those are all things to be aware of, that you always want to look at the physical and see if there's something physically going on.
Especially in individuals that might have limited verbal skills with autism, you can usually kind of look at that gut health, and if someone is more aggressive or just verbally acting out, I'm thinking of one person in particular, I can usually say, hey, when is the last time you used the restroom, or let's, and I can guarantee that they will use the restroom within the next 12 hours and their behavior changes dramatically. So just looking at those simple things to rule out the cause is great.
And the last function that we usually see is your sensory or self-stimulating behaviors. These are the people that are covering their ears when they go into a loud environment, or are maybe blinking or shutting their eyes or squinting when the lights are too bright. For your office spaces, if you can eliminate fluorescent lighting, it's huge. Fluorescent lighting, there's actually several different things. So people that are really sensory sensitive, fluorescent lights flicker all the time, even though you may not be able to see it. So for somebody that's super sensitive to that, they're going to be able to see that. They also hum. So if an individual has very acute hearing, they can hear them hum, and that can be very distracting or very irritating.
These are oftentimes the most difficult to create a replacement behavior for, though, especially the self-stimulating, maybe the hand flapping, those repetitive movements. It might be sounds that that individual makes, and those are difficult to kind of create and replicate in a more functional manner. It's tough.
So when you're looking at behaviors, every behavior has an antecedent or a setting event. You want to look at what happened before the behavior started. This is going to give you a clue of when that behavior might occur again. So antecedents typically occur right before the behavior starts, and then setting events make the behavior likely to occur. For the one time that I got hit, that individual had a very clear plan. He didn't go from 0 to 100. He didn't just get up out of the chair and hit me. He had he was perseverating, and then he couldn't resolve his perseveration. So then he moved to physical or verbal aggression. When he couldn't get that resolved, then it moved to physical aggression. So we knew with him that he was never going to just be physically aggressive out of the blue. It was a pattern that he followed, and we were able to determine that by the documentation and looking at kind of what his triggers were, what his setting events were.
And in discussing previously when Megan was mentioning the lighting and things like that, there is a large grocery store here in the northern Indianapolis area, and a lot of the autism clinics take individuals there for desensitization work, because when they bring individuals in there, they engage in aggression, escape-based behavior, things like that, and they're like, wow, there's nothing obvious happening in here, but what they found is there's like a high frequency, high pitch in the lighting, and it's a very tall ceiling. So it's fascinating. You have to be aware of all kinds of things. Oftentimes we'll have families go, well, they just, you know, out of the blue, they just engaged in this behavior, and there's always an antecedent. Something is always going to be spurring that behavior on.
We worked with an individual that staff would take her to the grocery store and she would just get about 20 feet in and sit down on the floor. And they couldn't get her back out. What we discovered is if you took her to a big box store, she would do that. If you took her to a small kind of neighborhood store, she wouldn't do that. The big box store was too big. She couldn't orient herself in the space. There was too much going on. There was too much stimulation. So she would just sit down. But when you would take her to a smaller store, she wouldn't do that. So describe the behavior, once again, being specific. That's operationally defining what did the behavior look like for that individual. I have clients that when they're agitated, they pace. I have another client that when she was agitated, she would pick her fingernails off. Same behavior, but looks very different for that client. So you want to know what and communicate to your team what that behavior looks like for that client. And then consequence. Consequence in this term is not like a punishment, and this just it's what gets the behavior to stop. So for the little kid that's screaming in the checkout line for the candy bar, the consequence could be that they are removed from the store and they get in the car and they stop screaming, or the consequence could be that they get the candy bar and they stop screaming. So it's not positive or negative in this sense of how we normally think about consequences, but it's just what got the behavior to stop.
And when you think of that positive, negative, that reinforcing or decreasing a behavior, that's when you kind of take that consequence a step further, and that's when you're training staff and families as to how not to reinforce the behavior or extinguish the behavior from occurring again.
So proactive strategies. We really want to give you guys ways to prevent behaviors from happening in the first place, and then how to get the behaviors to stop once they start. So proactive strategies are just how to prevent the behavior from occurring. The number one proactive strategy is you. Clients' behaviors are significantly affected by the people they interact with. So I have clients that if I walk in and I'm not smiling, they think something is wrong and they're going to react to that. They're going to think that I'm angry with them. And so they're going to react to that. So we're all human. I always tell staff, if you've had that rough ride into work, maybe you got stuck in traffic or there was an accident or you're late and you're just stressed, take that 2 to 3 minutes in your car before you walk in that door, do some deep breathing exercises, kind of de-stress before you walk in the door. Because if you carry that stress in, especially with our clients with developmental disabilities who may not always have great receptive language skills or expressive language skills, they may take that as they have done something wrong or you're angry at them. And so because they're not able to ask that you're going to see it in their behaviors. Your body language should match what you're saying. And your tone of voice should match what you're saying. That's where that sarcasm comes in. If I'm looking at somebody and have my arms crossed and but I'm saying something like, wow, it's really nice to see you today, that's my body language is not matching what my words are saying, and it's going to be very confusing for our clients. And try to keep your vocal tone and volume consistent. I have a young man that I work with who it's actually the one that hit me. But he had a staff who was very demonstrative with his hand gestures and had a very loud voice and talked very quickly. And my client used to clog the toilet and then he would have a panic attack because he was afraid he wouldn't have, one, that he was going to get in trouble, and two, that he wouldn't be able to use the bathroom. They only had one bathroom. And so my client would be in there plunging the toilet and the staff would come in and throw his hands up in the air and say, "What are you doing?" And the staff every single time would get hit. And it wasn't because the staff was my client was already nervous and he was already anxious because the toilet was clogged. He was reacting to the gentleman's hands coming up in the air and his vocal tone. And so that's something to be aware of, is that your vocal tone, what's really cool with this client is I can get him, like if he's really, really agitated, he talks very quickly and he talks very loudly. So if I drop my voice a little bit volume wise, he will actually match me, and I can actually you can watch it as I'm talking to him. I just keep bringing my volume down and he will match that. And I can usually within about 5 minutes get him down to a whisper, and that's taken that power and that frustration out of that. So just be aware of your vocal tone and volume consistent. Your behavior responses will dramatically impact your client's behavioral performance. Once again, know your client's background and history. What are their diagnoses, any diagnosis, and know what the history is if you can get that. We have clients that have had diagnoses change, throughout their lifetime as knowledge and more information comes up. So you want to know some of that back history. We've also had clients, we were working with an individual that was going between us and rehab, and in there, somewhere in her paperwork, she was diagnosed with Prader-Willi, and somewhere that disappeared. And so when they got her intake paperwork again, the Prader-Willi wasn't on there. Well, if you work with Prader-Willi, there's some very specific behaviors that everybody was like, why is she doing these things? And we finally realized that the Prader-Willi wasn't on there anymore. And that explained why she was doing the things that she was doing. So any diagnostic history that you can get is helpful. Do they take medication? Are they taking it consistently? Are they taking it correctly? And are those medications interacting with each other? I was working with a lady who was seeing a mental health provider who was prescribing one set of medications. She had a couple of panic attacks, ended up at the hospital, was prescribed a whole other set of medications, and the hospital referred to another psychiatrist who prescribed a whole other set of medications. So she was on like 6 different medications that were all interacting with each other and put her into a really, really bad panic attack. She actually ended up hospitalized for a period of time while they got her meds adjusted. So just being aware of what medications that they're taking, and the ones that are prescribed and the ones that maybe that they're taking that are not prescribed.
And that known drug history,
Yeah.
as you just hit the illegal substances, we have an individual that one of the behavior consultants is working with, and they started exhibiting some kind of irrational thoughts, some agitation, and young 20-year-old male, they're thinking, wow, is this schizophrenia? Are they, responding to auditory hallucinations? And it turns out that this gentleman has just discovered marijuana use with friends, and so it's causing all these other behaviors. But I think to touch on the biggest proactive strategy that I like to use is education and information for the people. So if you know about their background and history, and then they know what the next steps are, you're being proactive. And we touch on that a little bit later, but making sure everyone's aware of that next step in the schedule and the plan.
Know what their home life is like, who lives in the home, what's the consistency of schedule, how is their school day or work day? Are they seeing it? Are they coming in at the end of their work day? Are they coming in before they have to go to work and trying to get an appointment in before they have to be at work? And that's all going to affect their behaviors. Big thing, build rapport and get to know your clients. Have a relationship that is mutually trusting and not controlling. I don't know very many people that like to be told what to do all the time. So definitely developing that mutually trusting relationship. Give choices whenever possible. For individuals with developmental disabilities, we usually suggest limiting those to 2 or 3 choices. If you give open-ended choices, those can be difficult. The famous example that I always use is, where do you want to go to eat? And then the person always says, I don't know, where do you want to go? And then you spend 15 minutes trying to figure it out. So just giving choices. Do you want to go here or here? And for our individuals too, this is a great proactive strategy. We have individuals that refuse to go out into the community, not because they don't want to go out in the community, but they're asked where do they want to go, and they'll say, I don't want to go anywhere. If you give a choice, do you want to go to the park today or do you want to go to the museum? Then you're narrowing those choices down. You're still getting them out in the community. They're still being active.
And it also gives them that opportunity that if they have a lesser preferred activity that they have to do, to choose to do that first and get out of the way, or do something fun and then do the other activity. And being very, developing that relationship and that trust. If a person has to go to the dentist for a dental visit and they're fearful, let them know, way ahead of time so they can prepare and deal with that anxiety and really talk through the steps of what's going to happen so that they trust you that you're going to be honest with them in the future about things as well.
Lead time is huge.
Mm-hmm.
Prepping, especially for transition or for unexpected changes. I know that you were supposed to go to the grocery store today, but we have to go to the doctor first. Giving that lead time. Positive praise and feedback. We all like to hear good things about ourselves. And unfortunately for a lot of our individuals, they just hear about the bad stuff. And so really giving that positive praise and positive feedback, but make it warranted. People know when you're giving them false praise. So really give that feedback when it's warranted. First then statements, this is what Carrie was alluding to earlier. This is a great way to pair an undesired activity with a desired one. We have individuals that maybe refuse personal hygiene. So as soon as you brush your teeth, we can go to the store. Or as soon as you brush your teeth, we can go for a walk to the park. Pairing that desired and undesired activity.
The lead time, especially during this particular kind of pandemic phase of life, has been interesting because individuals that are used to going to day programs or to a work setting or to see family and they can't at this time is very difficult. So trying to introduce telehealth and Zoom meetings and different types of activities and kind of a virtual platform has been unique, and hats off to all the people that have created some really interesting and unique ways to interact with individuals, but it's still tough. It's tough to kind of provide that direct support during this time.
And structure and routine. And perfect lead in to that is that everybody's structure and routine is off right now. And so I think everybody's a little more anxious and a little more irritable right now. And there's no real timeline for our structure and routine for going back to normal. I was communicating with a client earlier this week, and she just kept repeatedly asking when she was going to be able to do something. And I unfortunately said, I'm not sure yet. But that's very anxiety inducing for her, of not knowing when she's going to be able to do the things that she normally does.
And it is for everyone. And I think that as we're addressing this with the clients that we work with, it's also impacting the staff, the family members, everyone that's interacting with these individuals. So it's important to support everybody that's on the team.
Helping clients communicate how they're feeling. I statements. A lot of times our clients just don't have the word for how they feel. And so just simply saying, and validating those feelings for them. Wow, it must be really frustrating when this happens, or wow, you seem really angry right now. Helping them just communicate how they're feeling. And modeling appropriate interactions. This one's big. Show the client how you want them to interact with you, and how you want them to interact with other people. If you're arguing with your coworker in front of a client, you're modeling arguing. And so that's something to be aware of. Active listening, putting your phone down, making eye contact when appropriate, not being on the computer, not constantly taking notes, things like that. For our clients, they're more in tune with body language than they are probably with the words that you're saying. And so once again, going back to that, make sure that your body's communicating that you're listening to them.
I've heard feedback from providers that during this time and providing telehealth, that has actually improved their active listening skills, because you have to be engaged. You're looking into a screen, you're constantly trying to engage that individual, and it's helping other folks. And it's been tough for some of our individuals that don't have that ability to sit and focus and connect in this platform. So we've come up with some pretty fun activities just to kind of keep them with us while we're trying to work on some different skills.
Build-in break times. These are huge, especially for activities that are long periods of time or activities that are not desired activities. So if you have something, let's say you're running a group and it's an hour-long group, that person may only be able to sit for 15 minutes or may need to have the ability to get up and walk around.
And it's good to have them built in. You can offer breaks to specific individuals, but oftentimes they're embarrassed or they might not want to be different than the crowd, especially maybe a student that's struggling in school doesn't want to necessarily raise their hand and ask for a break. So if you have those built in advance so that everyone has that opportunity, it doesn't single anyone out.
Once again, pairing desired and undesired tasks. Visual supports are huge, whether that's written or pictures or both. And once again, knowing your clients, how well do they read, but keeping things simple. And having clear expectations. You want things to be positive, directed, and observable. Grow up, knock it off, cut it out. Those are not directed. You can't watch somebody grow up. I mean, you can, but an example of this, my son was being funny, but I told him to cut something out and he said, I don't have any scissors. What am I going to cut out? But for our individuals, he was being a jerk at the moment. But that's something for our individuals. If you tell them to cut something out or knock something off, for them, knock off what? I don't understand what I'm being asked to do. So positive, you want to make it something that you can, that you want them to do. Like, please go have a seat in the chair, or please close the door instead of stop standing in the doorway. Please throw your trash in the trash can versus stop throwing your trash on the floor. You wanted to give them that positive alternative of what you actually want them to do. So reactive strategies, this is how to get the behavior to stop once it starts. Avoid power struggles. Nobody wins in a power struggle. And if everybody is safe, it is okay to walk away. And that's a really great thing to model. Say, hey, we're not getting anywhere right now. I'm going to step away for a minute and then we'll come back to this later.
And oftentimes, even as parents, we get into those arguments and those kind of rehashing events and on and on and on. And it's always better to just walk away and let it fade out.
Redirection, this is probably your best tool. Getting somebody involved in something else that is equally important. So you have two people in group that are arguing or just not getting along. Get one of them to help you with something. Get one of them to, can you go take this to so-and-so? Break that power struggle between the two of them and redirect one to do something else.
This is also good with individuals that have like autism or a different issue where they might be engaging in a particular behavior. If you can redirect them to an incompatible behavior, if they are, I had an individual that was screaming and yelling, and if you have them start singing, then they can no longer scream and yell. So it's a nice redirection as well.
Planned ignoring, this is way easier said than done. And it has to be consistent. So if you have somebody who is working with multiple staff, you have to get all of the staff on board to ignore the behavior. We have a behavior consultant that is a genius at this. She works with our deaf clients, and she had one client who would grab clothing to get attention. And so she would communicate with the client until the client grabbed her shirt, and then she would turn around and stop communicating with the client. When the client dropped her shirt, she would turn back around and begin communicating with the client. Took a while, but eventually the client learned, oh, guess what? When I pull on people's clothing, they stop interacting with me. If I want them to interact with me, I need to not pull on their clothing. In the process, she was also giving positive ways for them to interact. But that's a great example of plain ignoring, but it has to be consistent across the board. Our clients may have developmental disabilities, but they are very intelligent in some ways. And so they're going to figure out which staff they can get away with certain things with. So it's got to be consistent across the board.
And then looking at the function of that behavior too. If it's attention-based, that's good. If it is sensory seeking, what can you do to replace that? So you just really want to look at what the function is.
Modeling, once again, the person throws trash on the floor, you're actually modeling them that you want them to pick up the trash and throw it in the trash can. State the replacement behavior. Sounds kind of self-explanatory. Just tell them what you want them to do. They throw trash on the floor, please pick up your trash and throw it in the trash can. When a behavior is over, it's over. Don't keep reviewing it. This one is big, and unfortunately it goes against every one of our instincts because we want to continue to talk about behaviors and change them. For our individuals with developmental disabilities, they typically do not know why they're doing what they're doing, let alone do they remember it later. And so bringing something up that happened even 30 minutes before, they're going to be able to tell you necessarily why they did that or why they made that choice.
And it might evoke that behavior again.
Exactly. Or for some of you who may be seeing people, once a week or once a month or once every 3 months, if their staff or family or whoever are coming in with things that happened 2 and 3 months ago, the client probably doesn't even remember what happened then, let alone why they did what they did. So once it's over, it's over. And then focus on the positive and what you want the client to do. Once again, always go back to that positive. Using do this statements instead of don't do this. I love this. This is from the wisdom of Ross Green. If you're working with difficult kids, challenging children in the school system, I highly suggest you check out Ross Green. And the example that I always like to use with this, I was working with a young man in his early 20s. And one of his goals for many, many years was to do his laundry independently. And he just would not do it. He was a big guy. He was able to intimidate staff pretty well by his size. And so he would just refuse to do it and get in staff's face, and then staff would do his laundry for him. So we were coming at it from very much of a won't perspective. We were being very judgmental. He was being willful. He was being defiant. He's being lazy. He's just trying to manipulate the staff. The team started really looking at rewards and punishments. He has to earn so many points, or he has to do his laundry so many times before he gets his spending money, things like that. And it didn't fix the problem because we weren't looking at it from the right perspective. We were in a meeting and laundry was being discussed once again, and he finally yelled, "I don't know how much soap to put in. I know how to sort my laundry. I know how to operate the washing machine. I know how to operate the dryer. I don't know how much soap to put in." At one point in his preteen years, he had done laundry, put too much soap in, overflowed the washing machine, and suffered some pretty serious consequences from that. So he couldn't do laundry because he had a barrier. He had a skill deficit. He didn't know how much soap to put in. Staff bought him laundry, the Tide pods, the laundry detergent pods. He started doing his laundry independently. We would have never known that had he not communicated that barrier to us. Or with a gentleman who was told to go take a shower, and he would go in, put his head under the faucet, come out and say he took a shower. And staff said, "No, you didn't." "Yes, I did." Became this huge power struggle. I was getting reports all of the time. He's lying. He's saying he's taking a shower. He's refusing. Did a little more digging. He'd never showered independently. He didn't know the steps of taking a shower. So we did a visual schedule for him so that he knew the steps, and staff prompted him through the steps to take a shower. And then he was able to shower independently. What was being documented as refusal stopped, and what was being documented as lying stopped because he had a barrier. So basically find the stressors, reduce them, find the unmet needs, meet them, and find the skill deficits and teach them.
And oftentimes you have to be that detective, as it says, and look for those skill deficits, because the individual might not even realize they have a skill
Right.
deficit. They might think sticking their head under the water is a shower.
For him, it was.
Yeah.
That's what I do when I take a shower. I get my head wet.
Yeah. Or they might be embarrassed to ask or tell you, hey, I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to do here. Or it might be a history of trauma, because if they've done it before and they did it incorrectly, what that consequence was.
So really kind of reframing the behavior from the won't to the can't. When you're coming at it from that perspective, it's really going to change how you look at behaviors. Once again, consequence versus skill building. For the majority of our clients, rewards and consequences don't work for their behaviors because they have a lack of skills. It's not a lack of desire to do what they're being asked to do. It's a lack of a skill. So lack of skill does not equal lack of motivation to do better. My client wanted to be independent. He just didn't have the skill to be able to do it. So how do we build skills? You want to describe the task versus the behavior. So for Johnny, you want to say that Johnny's having a difficult time transitioning from gym to art class. You don't want to talk about what Johnny's doing during that time, but you need to look at where is the difficulty, what is behind the behavior, what is being communicated. And then divide the problems up. Don't lump them all together and be specific. Once again, going to the operational definition of what does Johnny look like when he's having difficulty with the transition? And what are the pieces in that transition that are difficult for Johnny? You don't want to talk about Johnny's difficulty with transition from gym to art class and Johnny's difficulty staying in his seat. Those are two different skills that he needs to practice, and so you want to address them separately. And don't add your theories as to why the difficulty is occurring. You really just want to kind of step back and observe. And don't apply your solution when describing the difficulty. Johnny's having trouble sitting in his seat, so he needs to have a standing desk or something like that. You don't want to build that, you don't want to apply a solution to build the skill. And model and role play those skills that you want to see the client use. We have individuals that may struggle through how to shop in a store. So you may use a social story and have them read a social story that you go through before they go into the store.
And I think individually based treatment is obviously important to all of us, but when you're looking at some of us who have been in the field for a while and we have our bag of tricks, making sure that we look at that individual and is this going to apply to them? Will this work with them? And get their feedback. What is going to be most effective as we're building these skills?
I had a client the other day that he helped me write his own social story. We had to write a social story. So he picked out the graphics that he wanted. He picked out what words he wanted to use. So it was his story. It wasn't something that I created for him. One way to teach skills, especially if you're teaching multi-step activities, is teach it in a linear pattern and have the workflow flow from left to right, up to down. Excuse me, sorry. I work with an individual that's a dishwasher. He has to rinse the dishes, put them in the dishwasher, wash his hands, take the clean dishes out of the dishwasher and put them on the rack to dry. The step that he was missing every single time was washing his hands between putting the dishes in the dishwasher and taking the clean dishes out. And that's because there wasn't a sink there. For him to wash his hands, he had to go back to the start of the whole process. And so he was missing that washing his hands. I had them put a sign at the end of the dishwasher that said, go wash your hands. So that would prompt him to go wash his hands. And there was a sign at the sink that said, go empty the dishwasher. So it would take him back to that chain. When you're having to move around and not a linear pattern, it's really easy to forget those things that you have to do, especially right now with everything else going on. Oh, when you're teaching, when you're teaching activity, like if you're teaching somebody to get dressed, you actually use a process called reverse chaining. So I don't know how you guys get dressed. This isn't how I get dressed, but for individuals, when we're teaching them to get dressed, we're going to do shirt, underwear, pants, socks, shoes. It's a linear pattern. It goes from the top of the body down. The gentleman in the shower, we taught him to wet his body down and start washing at the top of his head and go down his body, because it was a linear pattern for him to follow, and then rinse in the same pattern. So for the individual that we're teaching to get dressed, we're going to do shirt, underwear, pants, socks, shoes. The staff is going to do shirt, underwear, pants, socks, and then the individual is going to put their shoes on. And once they're successfully putting their shoes on, then staff does shirt, underwear, pants, and then the individual does socks, shoes, until they work up the chain to where they're doing their own shirt, underwear, pants, socks, shoes.
And that's a good process for individuals that have basically barriers for all of those skills to really address every piece.
Having written or visual instructions for each task, I actually designed these. We were doing a training for employers. So having a visual thing where they know that each task, okay, the first thing I do is review the packing list. Then I put those things in the box. Then I tape, then I label it. Having these are very easily readable schedules. You can pull a lot of these offline. There's all kinds of different software programs that you can do this with. Some are free, some have a subscription based. And Teachers Pay Teachers, honestly, is a great resource for a lot of these things. And they're usually pretty inexpensive. If you don't want to create your own visual schedule, if you jump on there, you can probably find whatever you need. So this is a visual schedule and a written schedule. This one just happens to have, they're able to check off when they've completed those tasks.
And that the Teachers Pay Teachers, this is what you'll often see in a classroom, so that you don't have to respond to the same question time and time again. So if you work in a residence, or if you're in some sort of group living setting and you just have these schedules for the basic kind of day-to-day tasks, it's nice, because then the individuals are necessarily not as prompt dependent. They might be more independent and go, oh, you know what, I don't need to ask, Megan, what I need to do. I can just check out the schedule and refresh my memory.
And people are less likely to argue with a schedule than they are with a person. So the big thing that we want to cover is, in the case of an emergency, know your agent's behavioral emergency policy, know who to call and what to communicate with that first responder. What are you able to communicate with that first responder? When we are calling, if we have to have first responder help, we are making sure that we are communicating that person does, that the people that we work with do have a developmental disability, so that the officer responding on site knows that that individual may not react or may not respond like you would normally think that they would. I work with a gentleman, he's not scary if you know him, but if you would meet him in a dark alley, you'd be afraid of him. He has very limited verbal skills, and he will only answer, he has a very interesting cadence. So if you say, what is your name? He will not answer you. But if you say, your name is, he will answer you. If you say, where do you live? He won't answer. But if you say, you live at, he will answer you. That's not a normal way that we talk. He eloped, he ran away, and he's a very patterned person. And so he didn't go the direction that he normally would. He went a different direction. And by the time mom arrived on site, he was handcuffed on the curb because it didn't get communicated to those officers that he has autism. And he was coming off to them as he was on something. And so they assumed that he was under the influence of some type of illegal substance. And he was starting to get violent because he couldn't communicate to them what he needed to communicate to them, because they weren't communicating to him how he needed to be communicated with. So those are things that you want to know, what you can communicate to those first responders. What's your agency's policy? There are agencies that say, well, you can't communicate any of this because of HIPAA, or do you have a release that says this is the information I'm able to communicate to a first responder?
It's important too. A lot of counties now have registries where you can be proactive and have that information in there. So if someone does call or get called out to a residence, it's on file. The officers can reflect on that. There are specifically trained officers that might be called out. So those are helpful for providers, for families, for anyone that might have an individual that might have a run-in with law enforcement.
We primarily work in Marion County. And so within Marion County, we have two different teams. There's CIT officers, which are crisis intervention trained officers, and then there's what's called the MCAT team. Some of the other counties are starting to develop their own, but both of those teams are designed for mental health crises. And so they're designed, those officers are trained to diffuse situations versus take control. So I always advise staff when they're calling within Marion County to request a CIT officer, the MCAT team, if they're available. We get a much more positive response from those officers than an officer that is traditionally trained. So find out what your county offers, what your area offers, what teams you have in place, and definitely reach out to them. Here's our contact information. Carrie's and mine. There's a little more information. You can visit our website. And for Indiana, for those of you that are in state, I've included the website for the Division of Disability and Rehabilitative Services, which covers all disability and I can't even say that word.
Rehabilitative.
Thank you. Services for the state of Indiana. And then the waivers that we specifically work under with the Medicaid are overseen by the Bureau of Developmental Disability Services. So I've included both of these websites.
Feel free to reach out with any questions or comments or suggestions, things like that.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a fantastic Memorial Day weekend. And again, Carrie and Megan, thank you so much for your presentation. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.